Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Lillincat. This is going to be my first doll video ever, and this is going to be for Dollightful's tropical collaboration. Once I saw her announcement for it, I was super stoked. This video probably isn't going to be the most informative video ever when it comes to doll customization, partly because I know I didn't do the greatest job at filming everything, and go ahead and let me know if that's something you would like me to do. If you want to know more about me and my channel and kind of what I do on the internet, stick around for the end and I'll talk some nonsense, but I would rather just jump right into the video. So here we go. So I'm starting here with Gigi Grant, but I ended up choosing her because as I was talking to my friend about this video, I picked up Gigi and I'm like, she kind of looks like a crab, like she could be kind of crab-like. And my friend was like, decorate a crab, that's what you should do. So I googled it, and basically they just take a bunch of stuff from the ocean and they put it on them, and it's like camouflage and poison. And so we start with crabs. That's where we're at. Crabs. So I start by cutting off all the hair, which, oh my god, I don't know if this doll was like in somebody's like garage in South Florida where it's hot and humid and gross, and I don't know, but the hair was really sticky. So I was just really excited to get this hair off the doll as soon as possible. So I dunk the doll's head in hot water, leave it there for a few seconds, and then rip the head off. And when I ripped the head off, oh my god, there was just glue everywhere, like all down her neck, on the neck peg. It was just really gross. So now I'm taking some pliers and I'm trying to get all the glue out. And it was really sticky. Like it was gross. I don't know how else to put it, but it was really bad. Like it stuck to the pliers, it stuck to my hands, I felt it on her face, like it was just everywhere. After I realized how sticky and gross this glue was, I realized that the head wasn't moving all that well on the neck, and that was probably the main contributing factor. So I had the very bright idea of putting the doll's head in acetone, because this glue just wasn't going to work with me. Before I put the doll's head into acetone, I decided it'd probably be a good idea to wipe as much paint off as I could before letting it sit in acetone, because I didn't want paint to just be floating around the doll. So I take a Q-tip and 100% acetone. The acetone I have is actually from Home Depot, so it's some pretty strong stuff, which might explain what happens later. But I take the acetone and some Q-tips and I use circular motions to get the paint off of the doll between a super damp side and then a drier side to kind of wipe up all the excess acetone and paint. I also take the paint off of her head because I'm going to be using a different color for her hair, and her scalp has to be the same color as her hair. I put the doll's head in acetone and I just let it sit there for probably 5 minutes, not even. And it was very successful in getting the glue out, but when I went to go use the pliers to get more glue out after I dipped it in acetone, I had poked a hole through her eye. This is fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's gonna be. It's fine. Just it's fine. So, in my frustration and almost a mental breakdown, I take some epoxy and I sculpt it into little tiny ball, and I did not film all of this process, but it probably took me about an hour and a half to get it exactly perfect the way that I wanted it to sit on the eye. So I filled the little hole with some epoxy, and we're just going to deal with that later, much later. I don't even want to think about it right now. So, goodbye, head. It's been fun. So then I move on to the body, and I start by sanding off the tattoo that she has on her chest. I switch between 400 and 200 grit, just depending on kind of how I feel about it. And then after I get the tattoo off, I just go ahead and sand her whole body with 200 grit, just to try to get off any sort of dirt or grime. After the sanding's complete, I move on to a little bit of body blushing. I'm using a lavender pastel to body blush, and I'm highlighting the grooves that she has in her mold. I'm choosing lavender to be the main color theme here, alongside with her pink body, because not only do I think lavender and pink just look really nice together, going along with the crab thing, I kind of decided to draw a little inspiration from Tamatoa from Moana. And we're also going to add some shiny later. So I realized after I put the footage together, but I didn't end up filming the process where I painted her hands and her feet purple. But what I ended up doing, and you can kind of see the remnants of such, is I took a makeup sponge and I put the purple on one half of the makeup sponge and a matte gloss on the other half of the makeup sponge, and I just kind of dabbed it on her hands and feet to where it made a very nice gradient from the tips of her fingers and the tips of her toes up towards her wrists and ankles, and the look ended up coming out really nice. The only problem with the makeup sponge is it kind of gives this texture to the paint, and it worked considering that she's underwater and there's sand and sea sponges and she has so much going on her body anyway that the texture was perfectly fine, but I probably wouldn't do that for most other dolls. So I made these barnacles out of air dry clay. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing, so I did not film this process. I wasn't even sure if it's going to work out well, and if it didn't, I didn't know. I didn't really have a backup plan. I used a wooden skewer and a needle to get a lot of like little tiny details in there, and I just tried my best. So before painting them, I decided to stick them on her using hot glue. I didn't want to color them beforehand because I wanted the option to choose the size before I choose the color. I wanted the freedom of being able to pick the different sizes of barnacles that would work the best in different places. So I hold off on painting and I just stick them on in a way that I think looks best. And after the barnacles, we move on to seashells. These are seashells that I just picked up at the beach. I'm really close to a beach, so I just sort of walked onto one and dug through the sand and picked up a few that I thought would work. And we're doing the same thing with the shells that we did with the barnacles, and I'm just sticking them on in a way that I think looks nice and fits the different parts of her body. Another thing it turns out I wasn't able to grab on camera is these little diamonds that I was able to put on her body as part as the Tamatoa shiny theme. And then after I got a lot of the big chunky stuff on, I moved on to putting these little tiny beads on her bodies for barnacles. And I definitely can't take credit for this. While I was putting my doll together, at the last minute might I add, I was going through the Tropical Doll 2019 tag on Instagram, and I found Lena Grandiflora, and they put these beads on that represented barnacles, and it was so great. And just their doll in general is absolutely fantastic. I use super glue to keep the beads on and it dries quickly, And I kind of go over it with Mod Podge later, which is basically just like an Elmer's glue type substance. And it works well to make it feel a little bit more cohesive rather than individual beads that are stuck onto the doll, as well as just a little extra hold to keep them on the body. And now it's time to paint the barnacles. I was so super excited to do this. So the paint that I use for the barnacles is mainly acrylic. The dark blue, green, and all the whites are acrylic, but those bright pinks, yellows, and greens are actually tempera paint. They're all water soluble, so I didn't really see an issue in using them, and I just so happened to have had that tempera paint kind of lying around, and the bright colors really worked for what I wanted to do. So I kind of just messed around with blending different colors and seeing what worked and what didn't, and I don't know, it looked pretty cool. By the end of it, I definitely would recommend tempera paint. It works just fine with acrylic. The only difference is that tempera paint is really, really watery. It's not a bad option, just something you should be aware of. It might not work for every project. You might have noticed the bright pink shoes that I have sitting on the table there. I introduced them to the camera at one point, and later on, as I was working on the doll, trying to figure out what kind of shoes she would have, I decided that shoes are not a good look for this doll, so ignore the shoes. Now we're going to be working on the outfit. For the outfit, I took some flower petals from a fake flower, ripped them up a little bit, and then I dipped them in Mod Podge and let them dry. The goal here was to kind of make it look like sea fauna or seaweed, or just kind of the stuff that you see floating around in the ocean. So I take some acrylic paint and I mix the colors that I want. And then I take those colors and I put them onto a makeup sponge like I did before with the hands and feet. And then I dab the makeup sponge on the petals to get this gradient effect on each one. And I honestly don't know how I managed this, but while I was painting, I spilled water everywhere. How could this happen to me? But I was really stubborn and I only had 4 more petals to go, so I just cleaned up my mess and used the paint anyway, and it didn't seem to make any difference, and I finished it without having to remix the paint. Instead of making a removable outfit, I super glued the petals onto her waist because I wanted the outfit to feel a part of her just as much as anything else. So after gluing the first layer of petals around her waist, I then take a second layer and I glue them underneath the first layer of petals. I do a similar thing for her top as well, which I did not end up getting on camera. And we're back to the head. I started the reroot process without filming because I realized I was running out of time. I was going to show the rest of the process of the reroot, but after I did the hairline, I realized how much hair she had. And since I'm putting her hair in a twisted updo, I realized I didn't need to reroot the rest of the hair because the yarn hair was so thick you're not going to be able to see any dead spaces anyway. So instead of doing extra work, we're just going to move on with what we have here. To make sure that her hair stays up and structured, I poke a hole through her head using a skewer, and I'm going to be using epoxy glue to keep a wire in place. And then I start to prep the face for the face up. I pin back her hair with a rubber glove and some leftover plastic bags. But before I actually start drawing on the face, I do a lot of work with the epoxy sculpt that I put on her eye from before, because I want it to blend as seamlessly into her face as possible. And at this point, I really wasn't sure how I was going to do that. It was very noticeable. There was this rough little dot in the corner of her eye, and I was really, really anxious as to how I was going to work that into the face seamlessly. So before actually doing any sort of face up, I pick at the epoxy a little bit. I sand it down with a tiny bit of sandpaper and a skewer. I also put a small dot of matte sealant over it to see if that would help smooth it over. So after I feel like I've done as much as humanly possible in order to work in this epoxy sculpt into her face, I begin the face up. Normally I would start blushing as my first step, but because I was so anxious about this eye, I decided to shape out the eyes first. So I take this coral pink pencil and I work with the mold as much as possible. After a little trial and error, I found that my best course of action was to pretend that the epoxy dot just was not there in the first place. After I shape the eye as best as I possibly can, I move on to the blushing. I'm using a lavender to blush her cheeks and the top of her head. I want the top of her head to kind of blend in with the purple hair that I have there as well. Later on, I discovered that the purple under her cheeks made her look very gaunt looking, because even though the purple I was using was technically a light lavender, on top of the pink, it just made it so much darker looking. I eventually opt to change that purple to a light blue, but that won't be for a while. So I use a white pencil not only to fill in the whites in her eyes, but to also start making a shape for her pupils. I decided the best way to hide the epoxy sculpt was to use the pink to create the corners of her eyes, and making the corners of her eyes the epoxy sculpt. I will later use whites and light pink to create more depth within the corners of her eyes. For the color of her eyes, I chose to start with a light blue. I wanted blue for her eyes because I didn't want everything to be one of two colors. Her main color schemes are obviously the purple and the pink, but she has a lot of other colors going on with all the coral, so I decided to make her eyes blue. I felt like they would pop more and feel more cohesive with the rest of her design. I use a dark blue to start penciling in where the pupils will be. The goal in using shades of blue and not using black yet is to create a fade of light blue to dark blue within her eyes, making them feel more dynamic and less one color. A few things to note while I work on her face. I do wear one white glove in case I start really handling her face. I want to keep the oils on my skin off of her face as much as possible. I also frequently turn the head upside down. That's a drawing trick. If something might not look right, you're able to decipher what is slightly off in a face if you turn it upside down. And before adding blacks, I take a red pencil and I start to use it to define the waterline. Normally I would not use red, but I was very determined to hide that epoxy sculpt. After using the red to figure out where her eye line would be, I then go back in with the pink and later on with some white to give the waterline some definition and highlights. I think the red worked out in her case just because she has so many striking colors on her. Here's her face after adding some black. I do apologize, I don't have a lot of footage of the process from here till the end. As I was frantically trying to get her together, I started to ignore the camera and really focus on getting the face up together. But more or less after that, I added more color to her eyeshadows. I also used a gold watercolor for the corner of her eyes, and then I added eyelashes. So here is the completed body modifications. After painting the barnacles and the coral, I also took some sand and mixed it with some gold glitter, and then I took glue and I glued the sand and glitter around the barnacles so they just filled in a little bit more and looked a little bit more seamless on her body. I also did that around the edges of her skirt, and there you also see the top as well. I painted gold accents on the molds of her body, as well as painting her nails gold. Added a few more little gems and tiny pearls that I had lying around. And then for her hair, I twisted it up around the wire, I sprayed it with hairspray, and I glued in some extra barnacles and sea anemones and gems and sprinkled some sand in there as well. Overall, I think her body and hair turned out absolutely fantastic. I'm super happy with it. But I must say there was a few issues with her face. This was the finished face-up that I took pictures for Dollightful's tropical collaboration. While I was taking pictures, she kind of took a fall in the sand. And when she did, there was definitely little mishaps with her face. So we're gonna fix her face now. I take some acetone that is slightly watered down. As you can see, there are a few almost scratch marks. That's the Mr. Super Clear breaking off of her face. And I'm not quite sure what did that because I don't think it was the fall in the sand. I think it had something to do with me putting her head back on her body. But that's okay because we're going to fix it now. I'm also taking off the blushing on the side of her face. For one side got scratched and marked up from the fall in the sand. And as I mentioned before, I found the dark purple to be a little bit too dark, making her face a little too gaunt for my liking. So we're just going to redo the blush as well since we're here. And instead of the dark purple, I take a light blue. And not only is the light blue less dark on her face, I also blush it on in such a way to where it's more of a blush and less of a cheekbone definition, which was definitely part of the problem the first time I did her blushing. Also, when she took her little fall into the sand, some of the gold paint that I used for her eyeshadow chipped off a little bit and it kind of messed up the eyeline. So I'm taking a black pencil and I'm just redrawing that. And then I'm taking the gold paint and I'm reapplying it. And lastly, I decided to do a few finishing touches. on her lips and just make her lips just a little bit more dynamic and less one color. There's also a little piece of sand in her lip as well. And after spraying her with the final spray of Mr. Super Clear, I take some high gloss finish and I paint her eyes and her lips with it. And she's done. And thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I plan on releasing doll custom videos once a month. I also do the occasional gaming stream on Twitch. If any of that interests you, I put links to my social media in the description, and I post a lot of updates on all sorts of stuff there. Thanks again. Bye!